The town of Willow Creek was quiet after midnight. Most of the houses had gone dark, and a soft autumn rain tapped against the windows. At the very edge of town stood an old wooden house surrounded by tall pine trees. No one had lived there for nearly 20 years. Then, one October evening, Daniel Carter received a letter. The envelope was plain, except for his name written in faded blue ink. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence. "Come home before the first snow." There was no signature. Daniel had not heard those words since he was a boy. His grandfather used to say them whenever winter approached, but his grandfather had been dead for 12 years. For several minutes, Daniel simply stared at the letter. Then he noticed something else. A small brass key had fallen from the envelope. Daniel recognized it immediately. It belonged to the old house. The next morning, he drove 3 hours north toward Willow Creek. The road became narrower as the mountains appeared, and by sunset, the familiar pine forest surrounded him. When he finally reached the house, everything looked exactly as he remembered. The porch still leaned slightly to one side. The windows were dusty. An old swing moved gently in the evening wind. Daniel unlocked the front door. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, dust, and something faintly sweet. He walked through the silent rooms until he reached his grandfather's study. Nothing had been touched. On the desk sat an old wooden clock. Daniel stepped closer. The clock suddenly began ticking. He froze. It had stopped decades ago. Then the hands moved backward. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. And from somewhere upstairs came a quiet sound. 3 slow knocks. Daniel looked toward the staircase. Nobody else was supposed to be in the house. He took a deep breath and climbed the first step. Then the second. As he reached the top, the knocking came again. This time, it was directly behind the bedroom door. Daniel slowly reached for the handle. Before he could touch it, a child's voice whispered from the other side. "Daniel, you finally came back." Daniel stood completely still. The child's voice had been so quiet that for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. "Daniel, you finally came back." He slowly placed his hand on the bedroom door. "Who are you?" he whispered. There was no answer. Daniel turned the handle. The door opened with a long, tired creak. The bedroom was empty. Moonlight entered through a narrow window, falling across an old wooden floor. A small bed stood against the wall, covered with a white sheet. Daniel remembered that bed. He had slept there when he was 8 years old. But something was different. On the pillow lay a small wooden toy train. Daniel's heart began beating faster. He knew that toy. It had belonged to his younger sister, Emily. Emily had disappeared 23 years ago. Everyone in Willow Creek believed she had wandered into the forest and never returned. Daniel had been the last person to see her. He had spent years trying not to remember that night. Now he picked up the toy train. A tiny word had been carved underneath it. "Run." Daniel stared at it. Then he heard footsteps downstairs. Slow footsteps. Someone was walking across the wooden floor. Daniel immediately put the toy in his pocket and stepped into the hallway. "Grandpa," he called. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. Daniel walked toward the staircase. Halfway down, he noticed something on the wall. A photograph. He had never seen it before. It showed his grandfather standing beside the old house. And beside him stood Emily. She looked exactly as Daniel remembered her. But there was something impossible about the photograph. It had been taken only 3 years ago. Daniel touched the frame with trembling fingers. Suddenly, the lights downstairs came on. Then the front door slammed shut. Daniel rushed down the stairs. The door was locked. He tried the handle. It wouldn't move. Behind him, the old wooden clock in the study began ticking again. This time, it was moving forward. And from the study came his grandfather's voice. "Daniel, don't open the cellar." Daniel stopped breathing. His grandfather had been dead for 12 years. Then the cellar door slowly opened by itself. Daniel stared at the cellar door. It was only a few steps away, but suddenly the entire house felt enormous. Cold air drifted up from the darkness below. "Daniel." His grandfather's voice came again. "Please." Daniel swallowed. He wanted to run outside, but the front door remained locked. The windows were too high to reach, and every room seemed to hold another memory from a childhood he had spent years trying to forget. He slowly approached the cellar. At the bottom of the stairs, darkness waited. Daniel found an old lantern on a nearby table, struck a match, and began descending. Each step groaned beneath his weight. Halfway down, he noticed photographs covering the walls. There were dozens of them. His grandfather, his mother, Emily, and Daniel. But the photographs showed moments he didn't remember. Emily standing beside the lake. Emily walking through the forest. Emily holding the same wooden tray now hidden in Daniel's pocket. Then he saw the final photograph. It showed Emily standing in the cellar. She looked older. Not 8 years old. Not even 10. She looked almost 25. Daniel's hands began to shake. Written beneath the photograph were 4 words. "She waited for you." A sound came from the darkness behind him. Daniel turned. Nothing. Then something touched his shoulder. He spun around and raised the lantern. A narrow wooden door stood at the end of the cellar. It hadn't been there a moment ago. Daniel walked toward it. As he approached, he heard quiet breathing from the other side. Then a girl's voice whispered, "You promised you would come back." Daniel closed his eyes. A memory suddenly returned. He was 8 years old again. He and Emily were standing in the forest behind the house. Rain was falling. Emily was crying. Daniel remembered holding her hand. He remembered telling her he would return. But he had never returned. He had forgotten why. Daniel reached for the door. Before his fingers touched the handle, something slid underneath it. A folded piece of paper. He picked it up. On the front, written in his grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "The truth about Emily is beneath the lake." Daniel looked toward the ceiling. Somewhere far above him, the old clock struck midnight. Then the cellar door slammed shut behind him. Daniel stood in the darkness, listening to the echo of the cellar door. For several seconds, he couldn't move. Then he unfolded the paper again. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's. "The truth about Emily is beneath the lake." Daniel remembered the lake. It was less than a mile from the house, hidden behind the trees. As a child, he and Emily had spent countless summer afternoons there, throwing stones into the water and building tiny boats from pieces of bark. But the night Emily disappeared, the lake had been the last place anyone saw her. Daniel lifted the lantern and searched the cellar. There had to be another way out. Behind several dusty boxes, he discovered a narrow wooden staircase leading upward. He climbed it and found himself inside the kitchen. The house was silent again. Daniel walked to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the path through the trees. He grabbed his coat. Before leaving, he returned to the study. The old clock was still ticking. On the desk, beside the clock, lay another photograph. Daniel picked it up. This one showed his grandfather standing beside the lake. Emily stood next to him. But Daniel noticed something strange. Behind them was a small wooden cabin. Daniel had never seen a cabin there. He turned the photograph over. A sentence had been written across the back. When the water is still, look beneath the red tree. Daniel immediately remembered the red tree. There was only one in the forest, a massive maple whose leaves turned crimson every autumn. He left the house and followed the narrow trail toward the lake. The forest was unusually quiet. No insects. No birds. Only the sound of his footsteps pressing into wet leaves. When Daniel reached the lake, the water was perfectly still. He looked across the shore. There it was. The red tree. Daniel walked toward it. At its roots, partially hidden beneath moss, he discovered a rusted metal box. His hands trembled as he pulled it free. The box was locked. But then Daniel remembered the brass key from the letter. He took it from his pocket. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. Inside was a small cassette recorder, a photograph of Emily, and a handwritten note. Daniel unfolded the note. Only 6 words were written. Listen before you remember everything. He pressed the recorder's button. Static filled the forest. Then a little girl's voice spoke. Daniel, if you're hearing this, I'm still here. Daniel nearly dropped the recorder. Emily's voice continued through the static. Daniel, if you're hearing this, I'm still here. But you must not trust Grandpa. Daniel stared at the lake. The water remained perfectly still. He pressed the recorder again, hoping to hear more. A long silence followed. Then Emily whispered, "He told me you would forget." Daniel's chest tightened. A sudden flash of memory struck him. He was standing beside the lake as a child. Emily was crying. Their grandfather was there. He was holding a lantern. Daniel remembered his grandfather saying something, but the words were hidden behind a wall of darkness in his mind. The recording continued. There's a room beneath the cabin, Emily said. Grandpa keeps everything there. The photographs. The letters. Everything he doesn't want anyone to find. Daniel looked toward the trees. The cabin from the photograph was nowhere in sight. He searched the shoreline until he noticed something beneath a thick layer of vines. Wood. A roof. The cabin was still there, hidden by the forest. Daniel pushed through the vines and opened the door. Inside, dust covered everything. An old chair sat beside a cold fireplace. On the floor were children's drawings. Daniel picked one up. It showed a house surrounded by trees. 2 children stood in front of it. But beneath them was a third figure. A tall man with no face. Daniel felt a chill. He turned the drawing over. On the back, Emily had written. He comes when the clock stops. Daniel froze. The old clock. Back at the house, it had started ticking again. He suddenly realized what that meant. Someone, or something, had been waiting for the clock to stop. Daniel searched the cabin until he found a wooden trapdoor beneath the rug. He pulled it open. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. The recorder crackled. Emily's voice returned. Daniel, don't go down there. He stared at the opening. Then another voice came through the recorder. His grandfather's voice. It's time. The batteries should have been dead. But the recorder kept playing. Daniel slowly lifted the lantern. Then he stepped onto the first stair. Behind him, the cabin door quietly closed. Daniel descended slowly, holding the lantern close to his chest. The staircase seemed much deeper than the small cabin above could possibly allow. 10 steps became 20, then 30. The air grew colder with every step. Finally, Daniel reached the bottom. A narrow stone hallway stretched into darkness. He moved forward. The walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them. Some showed Emily as a child. Others showed Daniel. There were pictures of his mother, his grandfather, and people Daniel didn't recognize. Then he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Every photograph showed the same cabin. The same lake. The same red tree. But the dates were different. Some photographs were decades old. Others were dated only a few years ago. Daniel stopped beside one photograph. It showed Emily standing beside the lake. She looked about 25. The date was last winter. Daniel touched the photograph. How? A sound came from somewhere deeper in the passage. A soft knock. Then another. Daniel followed the sound. The hallway ended at a heavy wooden door. There was a small glass window in the center. Daniel lifted the lantern. Someone was standing on the other side. A woman. She was wearing a blue coat. Her face was hidden by darkness. Daniel's heart began racing. Emily. The woman slowly raised her head. Daniel stepped closer. Then she whispered his name. Daniel. His knees almost gave way. It was Emily. Older, but unmistakably his sister. He reached for the door. Emily, what happened to you? She placed one finger against her lips. Don't open it. Daniel stared at her. What? She looked frightened. He can hear us. Who? Emily glanced behind her. Then she whispered. Grandpa. Daniel stepped back. That isn't possible. He's dead. Emily's eyes filled with tears. No, Daniel. The man who died 12 years ago was not our grandfather. The lantern flickered. For a moment, the hallway went completely dark. When the light returned, Emily was gone. The door stood open. Daniel rushed through it. Inside was a small room containing a table, several candles, and an old tape recorder. On the table lay a fresh photograph. Daniel picked it up. It showed him standing inside the room. But the photograph had been taken from behind him. And in the corner of the picture stood his grandfather. Smiling. The tape recorder clicked on by itself. A man's voice whispered. Daniel, now you remember enough. Daniel dropped the photograph. The tape recorder continued playing. You were always curious, Daniel, the voice said. That was your greatest weakness. Daniel recognized the voice immediately. His grandfather. Or at least, the voice of the man he had believed was his grandfather. Daniel backed away from the recorder. Where is Emily? The machine remained silent. Then the voice returned. Ask yourself why you forgot her. Daniel closed his eyes. Another memory surfaced. He was 8 years old. He and Emily were running through the forest. Someone was chasing them. Daniel could hear Emily crying behind him. Keep running. They reached the lake. Daniel turned around. A tall man stood between the trees. He was wearing his grandfather's coat. But his face was hidden. Emily grabbed Daniel's hand. Don't look at him. Daniel remembered turning anyway. The memory shattered. He opened his eyes. The underground room was empty. A door stood open on the opposite wall. Daniel stepped through it and found a second staircase. At the top was another room. This one looked strangely familiar. There was an old sofa, a wooden table, and a small television. Daniel realized he was looking at a perfect copy of his childhood living room. On the table were toys he remembered playing with. A wooden train. A red ball. A blue cup. Everything was exactly as it had been 23 years ago. Then he noticed a calendar hanging on the wall. October 17th. The year was the same year Emily disappeared. Daniel walked closer. A photograph had been pinned beneath the calendar. It showed Daniel and Emily standing beside the lake. Someone had written across the photograph. One of them remembers. Daniel heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Emily stood in the doorway. This time she looked older than before. Her eyes were tired. "Daniel," she said quietly, "you have to leave." He shook his head. "Not without you." Emily looked toward the hallway. "He knows you're here." "Who is he?" She hesitated. Then she whispered. "The man who has been living inside our memories." The light suddenly went out. A deep voice spoke from somewhere in the darkness. "Emily." She grabbed Daniel's arm. "Don't answer him." The voice came again. "Emily, bring your brother home." And somewhere above them, the old clock began ticking backward. Emily pulled Daniel through the darkness. "Keep your eyes closed," she whispered. Daniel obeyed. They moved quickly through the narrow hallway. He could hear footsteps behind them, slow and steady, never getting closer but never disappearing either. "Where are we going?" Daniel asked. "Somewhere he can't follow." Emily opened a hidden door. Cold night air rushed across Daniel's face. They stepped outside behind the cabin. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The forest looked completely different under the moonlight. Emily took Daniel's hand. "I've waited a long time for you." Daniel stared at her. "Why didn't you come home?" "I tried." Her voice trembled. "Every time I found a way out, I forgot where I came from." Daniel looked toward the lake. "So what is this place?" Emily shook her head. "It isn't really a place. It's a memory." Daniel frowned. "A memory?" "Yes. Grandpa discovered something beneath Willow Creek long before we were born. He believed the lake could preserve memories." She pointed toward the water. "People who entered the underground rooms could see the past. But he wanted more. He wanted to live inside those memories forever." Daniel remembered the photographs. "He trapped you." Emily nodded. "He trapped himself first." A cold wind moved through the trees. Daniel suddenly noticed something strange. Emily's footprints ended several feet behind them. There were no footprints beneath her. He stared at the ground. Emily saw his expression. "You noticed." Daniel slowly stepped away. "Are you really here?" Emily looked down. "I don't know." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver pendant. "Do you remember this?" Daniel recognized it. Their mother had given it to Emily on her 8th birthday. "I gave it back to Mom the night you disappeared," Emily said. Daniel's eyes widened. "Then how do you have it?" Emily smiled sadly. "Because I never disappeared." A distant church bell rang once. Then the lake began to ripple. Emily turned toward it. "He's waking up." "Who?" She didn't answer. The surface of the lake slowly opened in a perfect circle. Beneath the water, a staircase appeared. Daniel stared in disbelief. Emily squeezed his hand. "The truth is down there." Then she stepped toward the lake. Daniel followed. Daniel stepped into the lake beside Emily. The water was strangely warm. With every step, the surface rose around them, yet neither of them seemed to sink. Beneath the dark water, the stone staircase remained perfectly clear. Emily continued downward. Daniel followed. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. No wind. No rain. No sound of the forest. Only their breathing. At the bottom of the staircase stood a large iron door. Emily pressed her hand against it. The door opened. Beyond it was a room larger than anything Daniel could have imagined beneath the lake. Hundreds of clocks covered the walls. Some were ticking. Some were stopped. Others were moving backward. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table covered with photographs. Daniel walked toward it. Every photograph showed a memory from his childhood. His first day of school. His mother's birthday. Christmas morning. Emily's 8th birthday. Then Daniel found one that made him stop. It showed him standing beside Emily on the night she disappeared. But the photograph revealed something Daniel had never remembered. His grandfather was standing behind them. And he wasn't alone. Another man stood beside him. The second man's face had been scratched away. Daniel picked up the photograph. "Who is that?" Emily looked frightened. "He was the first one." "The first what?" "The first person Grandpa brought here." Daniel turned toward her. "Why?" Emily looked at the clocks. "Because he wanted to prove that memories could become places." Suddenly, one clock stopped. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, every clock in the room was silent. Emily grabbed Daniel's arm. "We have to go." A door opened at the far end of the room. A man walked through. He wore an old gray coat. His hair was white. His face looked exactly like Daniel remembered. His grandfather. Daniel couldn't move. The old man smiled. "You came back." Daniel stepped in front of Emily. "You're not my grandfather." The man laughed softly. "No." He looked toward Emily. "But she is not your sister either." Daniel's heart sank. Emily shook her head. "Don't listen to him." The old man reached into his coat and pulled out a small brass key. "You have forgotten the most important part, Daniel." He held up the key. "You were the one who opened the door." The room suddenly shook. Water began pouring through the ceiling. Emily grabbed Daniel's hand. "Run." Behind them, every clock started ticking at once. Daniel ran beside Emily as water rushed across the stone floor. The clocks on the walls began spinning wildly. Their hands moved forward, backward, and forward again, creating a strange rhythm that sounded almost like hundreds of tiny heartbeats. "Where do we go?" Daniel shouted. Emily pointed toward a narrow passage. "There." They hurried through the doorway. Behind them, the old man remained completely still. He wasn't chasing them. He was smiling. Daniel glanced back. "Why isn't he following us?" Emily didn't answer. They reached the end of the passage and found a circular room. In the center stood a large mirror. Daniel looked into it. He expected to see himself and Emily. Instead, the mirror showed two children. Daniel was 8 years old. Emily stood beside him. Both were crying. Then the scene changed. Their grandfather appeared. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You can save her," he said. Daniel watched the memory unfold. The old man led the children toward the lake. Emily was frightened. Daniel remembered the words now. His grandfather had promised that if Daniel entered the underground room, Emily would never disappear. But there had been a condition. Daniel had to forget. The memory shifted again. Emily was pushed through a doorway. Daniel screamed and tried to follow. His grandfather held him back. Then everything went dark. Daniel stepped away from the mirror. "I remember." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "You finally do." Daniel turned toward her. "What happened after that?" Emily looked at the mirror. "I stayed here. For 23 years. She shook her head. "Time doesn't work normally down here." Daniel looked confused. "To me, it felt like months. To you, it was years." A loud crack echoed through the room. The mirror began to fracture. Emily grabbed Daniel's hand. "We need to leave before he changes the memory again." Who is he? Emily looked toward the passage. The man you called Grandpa wasn't controlling this place. Daniel's stomach tightened. Then who was? Emily pointed at the mirror. The cracks spread across the glass. Behind their reflections appeared a third figure. A tall, faceless man. Emily whispered. The first memory. The mirror shattered. And the room disappeared. Daniel opened his eyes to the sound of rain. He was lying on the wooden floor of his grandfather's study. For several seconds, he couldn't remember how he had gotten there. Then Emily's face came back to him. He sat up quickly. Emily. No answer. The house was silent. Daniel rushed through the rooms, searching every corner. The front door was open. Outside, rain fell heavily across the porch. He stepped into the yard. Emily. Nothing. Then he noticed footprints in the mud. 2 sets. One belonged to him. The other was much smaller. Daniel followed them toward the forest. They ended beside the red tree. At its roots sat the brass key. Daniel picked it up. A folded piece of paper was attached to it. He opened the paper. 3 words were written in Emily's handwriting. Find the house. Daniel looked around. He knew exactly which house she meant. The old house where they had grown up. He hurried back. Inside, everything looked normal. Almost. The old clock in the study had stopped at midnight. Daniel remembered Emily's warning. He walked toward the clock and examined it carefully. Behind it, he discovered a small hidden switch. He pressed it. A section of the wall opened. Behind it was a narrow room. Inside were boxes filled with journals. Daniel opened the first one. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather. The first page was dated 47 years earlier. I found the lake today. Daniel continued reading. The journal described a strange underground chamber beneath the water and a mysterious phenomenon that allowed people to experience memories as though they were physically present. But the final pages were different. His grandfather had become obsessed. He wrote about a presence beneath the lake. Something older than the town. Something that didn't create memories. It consumed them. Daniel turned another page. A sentence had been underlined repeatedly. It needs a person to remember it. Daniel felt a coldness spread through him. Then he heard a floorboard creak behind him. He turned. Emily stood in the doorway. But she looked terrified. Daniel, she whispered. What? She pointed toward the journal. You read the name. Daniel looked down. He hadn't noticed it before. At the bottom of the page was a single word. A name. Elias. Emily stepped backward. He knows you remember him now. Daniel stared at the name. Elias, he whispered. The room seemed to grow colder. Emily closed the hidden door behind her and locked it. You shouldn't have read that, she said. Who is Elias? Emily looked at the journal. He was our great-grandfather. Daniel frowned. Our great-grandfather? He disappeared when Grandpa was a boy. Everyone thought he died in the mountains. Daniel opened the journal again. The next pages had been torn out. Then why is he connected to the lake? Emily sat down. Because he was the first person who went inside. Daniel remembered the faceless figure from the mirror. Was that him? Emily nodded. He entered the chamber beneath the lake and found something waiting there. He believed it could preserve a person's memories forever. And did it? Not exactly. Emily looked toward the window. It preserved everything except the person. Daniel felt a chill. What does that mean? The memories remained. The feelings remained. Even the voice remained. But the person slowly disappeared. Daniel looked at the photographs covering the walls. So Elias became that thing. Emily shook her head. No. Something became Elias. Silence filled the room. Then the old clock suddenly started ticking. Daniel looked at it. The hands were moving backward. Emily stood immediately. We have to leave. Why? Because he knows where we are. A knock came from the other side of the hidden door. 3 slow knocks. Daniel and Emily stared at each other. Another 3 knocks. Then a man's voice came through the wood. Daniel. Daniel recognized it. His grandfather. Emily grabbed his arm. Don't answer. The voice came again. You've been looking for your sister for 23 years. Daniel stepped closer to the door. The voice became softer. She isn't the one you lost. Daniel looked at Emily. She had gone completely pale. What does that mean? Daniel asked. Emily whispered, he's lying. The voice continued. Ask her what happened on the night your mother died. Daniel froze. He had never told Emily about that night. He had never told anyone. The door handle began turning. Emily pulled Daniel toward the window. We need to get out now. They climbed through the window and dropped into the wet grass. Behind them, the hidden door burst open. Daniel turned. A tall figure stood inside the room. His face was hidden beneath the darkness. But Daniel could hear him smiling. Run if you want, the figure said. I've already remembered where you live. Daniel and Emily ran through the rain without looking back. They crossed the yard and disappeared into the forest. Only when they reached the old stone bridge did Emily finally stop. Daniel bent forward, trying to catch his breath. What did he mean about Mom? Emily looked at the river below. I don't know. You're lying. She turned toward him. I wish I were. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Daniel stared at her. What happened the night Mom died? Emily's eyes filled with tears. I wasn't supposed to remember that either. Daniel waited. Emily slowly sat on the stone wall. Mom didn't die in an accident. Daniel felt the world go quiet. What? She went to the lake. Why? Because Grandpa called her there. Daniel remembered the old man's voice. What did he want? Emily looked toward the forest. He wanted Mom to give him something. What? Her memories. Daniel shook his head. That doesn't make sense. It didn't to her either. Emily explained that their grandfather believed certain memories could be transferred from one person to another. He thought painful memories were like doors, and if someone learned how to open them, they could enter the past. Their mother had discovered what he was doing. She tried to stop him. That night, she went to the lake alone. She never came back, Emily whispered. Daniel's hands tightened. Then how did everyone say she died? Grandpa told them she had an accident. A long silence followed. Daniel looked at the river. Why didn't you tell me? Because he made me forget. Suddenly, something moved between the trees. Daniel turned. A man stood far away. Gray coat. White hair. Watching them. Daniel blinked. The figure disappeared. Emily grabbed his arm. We can't stay here. They hurried toward the town. But when they reached the road, Daniel stopped. Every streetlight in Willow Creek had gone dark. The entire town looked abandoned. Then a church bell rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Emily looked at the clock tower. Its hands pointed to midnight. But it's only 10. Daniel looked at his phone. The screen showed no signal. Then the phone displayed a message. One sentence. Come back to the house. Daniel slowly lowered the phone. Emily whispered. He's changing the town. And somewhere behind them, a little girl's laughter echoed through the trees. Daniel and Emily stood frozen in the middle of the empty road. The child's laughter faded into the forest. Then the streetlights flickered back on. For one brief moment, Willow Creek looked normal again. Cars sat quietly along the roadside. Storefronts were dark. Porch lights glowed warmly across the neighborhood. But Daniel knew something was wrong. Every house had the same clock in its window. And every clock showed midnight. Emily pulled him toward an old diner. We need somewhere safe. They entered through the back door. The diner was empty. Daniel locked it behind them. Emily walked toward the counter and found an old newspaper lying beneath a layer of dust. She picked it up. Daniel looked over her shoulder. The headline made his blood run cold. Local family disappears after midnight. The date was tomorrow. Daniel stared at it. That hasn't happened. Emily shook her head. It hasn't happened yet. Daniel looked at the newspaper again. The photograph beneath the headline showed their house. And standing on the porch were Daniel and Emily. He turned toward the window. Across the street, a figure stood beneath a street lamp. Their grandfather. Daniel rushed outside. The street was empty. Emily followed. He wants us to go back. Why? Because that's where the door is. What door? The one you opened when you were 8. Daniel remembered the cellar. The brass key. The hidden room. Then he understood. The door isn't beneath the lake. Emily shook her head. No. She pointed toward the house at the edge of town. The door is beneath our old home. They walked back through the silent streets. As they approached the house, Daniel noticed something strange. The windows were glowing. Warm yellow light filled every room. But the house had been empty when they left. Emily stopped at the gate. I can't go inside. Why? Because the last time I entered, I didn't come out. Daniel took her hand. This time we leave together. They opened the front door. Inside, the air was warm. The old clock was ticking normally. Daniel stepped into the hallway. Then he heard a familiar sound. A child running upstairs. He looked at Emily. She whispered. That was us. Daniel slowly followed the footsteps. At the top of the stairs, he found a small bedroom. The door was open. Inside, 2 children sat on the floor. Daniel and Emily. Both were 8 years old. And they were looking directly at him. Daniel stopped at the bedroom doorway. The 2 children sitting on the floor were unmistakably him and Emily, exactly as they had looked 23 years ago. Young Daniel held the wooden train. Young Emily held the silver pendant. Neither child spoke. Then the younger Daniel slowly turned toward the bedroom window. He pointed outside. Daniel followed his finger. The forest beyond the house was covered in thick fog. A tall man stood beneath the red tree. Even from that distance, Daniel knew who it was. Elias. Young Emily suddenly whispered something. Daniel couldn't hear her. He stepped closer. What did she say? Emily stood beside him. She said, "Don't let him see the key." Daniel reached into his pocket. The brass key was still there. Suddenly, the younger Emily looked directly at Daniel. Her eyes filled with tears. "Give it to me." Daniel froze. Emily grabbed his arm. "Don't." The child repeated herself. "Give me the key, Daniel." Daniel took a step backward. How does she know? Emily didn't answer. The room began changing. The wallpaper faded. The furniture disappeared. The two children became shadows. Then the bedroom transformed into the night of Emily's disappearance. Rain hammered against the windows. Young Daniel stood beside his sister. Their grandfather entered the room. He carried a lantern. "You promised," the old man said. Daniel watched the memory unfold. Young Emily refused to move. "I don't want to go." Their grandfather looked at Daniel. "You said you wanted to save her." Young Daniel began crying. "I do." "Then open the door." The old man pointed toward the floor. A small brass keyhole appeared beneath the bed. Daniel suddenly remembered. He had opened that door. He had believed it would save Emily. But when the door opened, something had reached through the darkness. Not a hand. A voice. It had spoken directly into his mind. "Give me your memory." Young Daniel had agreed. The room shook. The memory disappeared. Daniel fell to his knees. "I did this." Emily knelt beside him. "You were a child. But I opened the door. You didn't know what was behind it." A slow clap echoed from the hallway. Daniel and Emily turned. Elias stood outside the bedroom. This time, his face was visible. He looked exactly like Daniel. Not old. Not young. The same age. The same eyes. The same scar above the eyebrow. Daniel stared at him. Elias smiled. "Now you finally understand." He held out his hand. "You didn't bring Emily here." He pointed toward Daniel. "You brought me." Daniel couldn't speak. Elias stood in the hallway, looking exactly like him. Emily stepped between them. "Don't listen to him." Elias smiled. "You've been listening to her for 23 years. Daniel looked at Emily. "What does he mean?" Emily shook her head. "Daniel, please." Elias took one slow step forward. "You want the truth?" Daniel nodded. "Then ask her why she remembers everything except the night you opened the door." Emily's face changed. Daniel stared at her. "What happened?" She looked down. "I made a choice." "What choice?" "I took your memories." Daniel felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes. Emily explained that after Daniel opened the door, the presence beneath the house began consuming him. Emily had tried to stop it. She couldn't destroy it. So she made a bargain. She gave it her own memories instead. Then she used the silver pendant to hide Daniel's remaining memories inside the house. "But why?" "Because I wanted you to have a normal life." Daniel looked at Elias. "Then who is he?" Emily's voice became barely audible. "He's what's left of you." Daniel stared at the figure. Elias laughed softly. "When you gave up your memories, something had to remain behind." He touched his chest. "I became the part of you that remembered everything." Daniel stepped backward. "So you're not Elias?" Elias smiled. Elias was only the first name. The house trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. The old clock downstairs began striking midnight again. Emily grabbed Daniel's hand. "We have to destroy the key." Daniel looked at the brass key. "How?" "Take it to the lake." Elias suddenly moved. He crossed the hallway so quickly that Daniel barely saw him. Emily pushed Daniel aside. The key fell to the floor. Elias reached for it. Daniel lunged forward and grabbed it first. The moment his fingers closed around the brass, every light in the house went out. A voice filled the darkness. Not Elias. Not Grandpa. Not Emily. Daniel heard his own voice. "Open the door." A hidden doorway appeared behind the bed. Emily stared at it. That wasn't there before. Daniel slowly approached. The brass key began glowing in his hand. Then the door opened by itself. Beyond it was a long staircase descending into darkness. At the bottom, something was waiting. Something that had been waiting since Daniel was 8 years old. Daniel stood at the top of the staircase. Emily remained behind him. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "don't let go of my hand." Daniel nodded. They descended together. The stairs seemed endless. With every step, Daniel remembered something new. His first bicycle. His mother's voice. Emily laughing beside the lake. The smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. Memories he had forgotten for years returned one after another. Then they reached the bottom. A vast underground chamber stretched before them. At its center stood a black pool. The water was perfectly still. Across the pool was a single wooden chair. Someone was sitting in it. Daniel lifted the lantern. His breath stopped. It was himself. An 8-year-old boy. The child looked frightened. Daniel approached slowly. "Daniel?" The boy looked up. "Did you come to take me home?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Yes." The child shook his head. "You can't." "Why?" "Because I promised." "Promised who?" The boy pointed toward the black water. A ripple moved across its surface. Then a voice rose from beneath it. "Me." The water began glowing faintly. Elias appeared behind Daniel. "You finally reached the beginning." Daniel turned. "You wanted me to come here." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you cannot destroy what you refuse to remember." Daniel looked at the child. "What am I supposed to remember?" The boy answered. "You left me here." Daniel's chest tightened. "I was 8. You promised you'd come back." "I did come back." The child shook his head. "No. You came back because you forgot me." Daniel looked at Emily. She was crying. Then she walked toward the child. "I promised him I would return." The child looked at her. "You never did." Emily closed her eyes. "I couldn't." The black water suddenly rose into the air. A shape formed above it. A tall, faceless figure. The same figure Daniel had seen in the mirror. It reached toward him. Daniel stepped forward instead of running. He held out the brass key. "I remember now." The figure stopped. Daniel continued. "I remember opening the door. The chamber trembled. I remember being afraid." The figure moved closer. "And I remember choosing to save Emily." The child stood up. For the first time, he smiled. The brass key cracked in Daniel's hand. A bright light burst through the chamber. The faceless figure screamed. Then the entire underground world began collapsing around them. Daniel grabbed Emily's hand. "Run!" They raced through the collapsing chamber. Stone walls cracked around them. Water poured from the ceiling, flooding the staircase behind them. The old house shook violently above. Emily stumbled. Daniel caught her before she fell. "Keep going." They reached the top of the stairs and burst into the bedroom. The room was changing again. For a moment, Daniel saw his childhood home exactly as it had been. Then it became the abandoned house. Then the forest. Then the lake. Everything seemed to exist at once. Elias stood in the middle of the room. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You can't destroy me," he said. Daniel looked at him. "I don't have to." Elias frowned. "You don't understand." "I do." Daniel stepped closer. "You are part of me." Elias became still. "You were created from everything I was afraid to remember." You grew because I kept running from those memories. The house shook again. Emily stood beside Daniel. Elias looked at her. You helped him forget. Yes, she said. And you destroyed yourself doing it. Emily lowered her eyes. Daniel suddenly understood. The Emily standing beside him wasn't the same sister who had disappeared. She was a memory too. A memory that had survived because Daniel refused to let her go completely. Emily, he whispered. She looked at him. You knew. She nodded. I've known for a long time. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Can you leave? Emily smiled. Only if you do. The walls began fading. Elias stepped backward. No. Daniel reached toward him. I remember you. Elias stared at him. You remember everything? Yes. The figure began changing. His face shifted from Elias to Daniel, then to the frightened 8-year-old boy. Finally, he became a faint shadow. Then you don't need me anymore. Daniel nodded. The shadow disappeared. Silence filled the room. Emily took Daniel's hand. It's time. They walked downstairs. The front door stood open. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling. Daniel looked back at the house. For the first time in 23 years, it looked ordinary. Just an old wooden house beneath the trees. Then Emily whispered. Thank you for coming back. Daniel turned toward her. She was gone. Only the silver pendant remained in his hand. Daniel closed his fingers around it. The snow continued falling softly. And somewhere inside the house, the old clock finally stopped. Daniel stood beneath the falling snow, holding Emily's silver pendant in his hand. For the first time in years, the silence around Willow Creek felt peaceful. He looked back at the old house. The windows were dark. The porch was covered with snow. Nothing moved behind the glass. Daniel turned toward the road and began walking. He didn't know where he was going. For the moment, it didn't matter. He only wanted to leave the house behind. By sunrise, Daniel reached the center of Willow Creek. The town was waking slowly. A bakery opened its doors. A truck passed along the empty street. People stepped outside and brushed snow from their cars. Everything looked normal. But Daniel noticed something strange. Nobody seemed to remember the storm. Nobody remembered the house. Nobody remembered Emily. He walked into the small diner and sat beside the window. An elderly waitress approached. Coffee? Daniel nodded. Please. She placed a cup in front of him. Then she looked at the pendant in his hand. Her expression changed. Where did you get that? Daniel looked up. It belonged to my sister. The waitress became pale. Emily. Daniel froze. You remember her? The woman looked toward the window. I remember everything. Daniel leaned forward. What happened to her? The waitress lowered her voice. Your family wasn't the first. Daniel's heart began beating faster. What do you mean? She glanced around the diner. There were others before you. Others who went into the lake. She nodded. My father disappeared there when I was a little girl. Daniel stared at her. Did he ever come back? No. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small envelope. This was left for me 20 years ago. Daniel opened it. Inside was a photograph. His grandfather stood beside the lake. Beside him were several people Daniel had never seen. But in the background stood a young man. Daniel recognized him immediately. Elias. The photograph was dated 60 years earlier. Daniel turned it over. A message had been written on the back. The door is closed, but the lake still remembers. Daniel looked at the waitress. Is it over? She shook her head. No. Outside, the snow suddenly stopped falling. The sky became perfectly clear. Then every clock in the diner stopped at the same moment. The waitress whispered. It only begins when someone remembers. Daniel slowly looked toward the window. Across the street stood a little girl. She was holding a wooden toy train. Daniel stood up. The girl smiled. Then she turned and walked toward the lake. Daniel followed the little girl. He didn't run. He simply walked through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, watching her small figure disappear between the trees. The lake waited beyond the forest. When Daniel reached the shore, the girl was standing beneath the red tree. She turned around. For a moment, Daniel thought he was looking at Emily. Then the girl's face changed. She became older. Then younger. Then someone Daniel had never seen before. Finally, she became a little girl again. She held out the wooden train. Daniel didn't take it. Who are you? The girl smiled. I am the memory you left behind. The lake became completely still. Daniel looked into the water. He saw the old house. He saw his grandfather. He saw his mother. He saw Emily. Then he saw himself as a child, standing beside the lake. But this time, the memory continued. Young Daniel had opened the door beneath the house. The darkness had reached for him. But Emily had stepped between them. She had given herself to the darkness so Daniel could escape. Daniel finally understood. Emily hadn't been trapped because of him. She had chosen to protect him. The girl lowered the wooden train. You remember. Daniel nodded. Tears ran down his face. I'll never forget her again. The girl smiled. That is all she wanted. A soft wind moved across the lake. The trees whispered. Then the water began to glow. For one brief moment, Emily appeared on the opposite shore. She looked exactly as Daniel remembered her at 8 years old. She smiled. Daniel smiled back. I love you, Emily. She raised her hand. Then she disappeared with the morning light. The lake became ordinary again. Daniel stood there for a long time. Eventually, he turned toward Willow Creek. The sun was rising over the mountains. The town no longer felt haunted. It felt peaceful. Daniel returned to the old house one final time. He walked through every room. He opened the windows. He let the cold morning air enter. Then he placed the silver pendant beside the old wooden clock. The clock began ticking. Once. Twice. Then it stopped. Daniel smiled. He closed the front door and walked away. Years later, people in Willow Creek would tell stories about the old house near the lake. Some said strange things happened there. Others said it was nothing more than an abandoned home. Daniel never corrected them. He knew the truth. Some memories disappear. Some memories remain. And some wait quietly in the dark until someone finally remembers. And so, Daniel finally walked away from Willow Creek, carrying one last memory with him, the memory of Emily. Some stories end when the final mystery is solved. But some stories stay with us long after the last words are spoken. If you enjoyed this story, you can stay a little longer in the quiet, let your mind wander, and remember the people and moments that matter most. Thank you for listening. Until the next story. Tata.